November 27, 1941, 12 kilometers east of Klin, Western Front, USSR. The snow fell sideways, the sky dead white above broken pine trees, the air so bitter it cracked the skin on your knuckles, even through wool. German panzer divisions were pushing hard from the northwest. Supply lines to the front had been fractured 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Trucks burned on the side of frozen roads. Horse-drawn sledges froze solid in motion. Men died waiting for bandages, cartridges, bread, or boots that never came. Inside a shallow dugout, made from railway ties and scorched bricks, a junior quartermaster sat alone, staring at the warped track map of the Kalinin sector. His name was Vladislav Leonidovich Burkov, born 1907, a civilian railway inspector from Vyazma, drafted 5 months earlier and reassigned to the 9th Army's Rear Logistics Battalion after his transport column was destroyed outside Smolensk. His file read, "Technical aptitude, medium morale unknown." At that moment, morale across the 9th Army was non-existent. Supply convoys were failing. 3 out of every 5 trucks dispatched from Mozhaisk to the Klin line never arrived. Luftwaffe scout planes spotted them within hours. Dive bombers picked them off one by one on the exposed roads. The drivers began to refuse orders. Ammunition dumps near Volokolamsk were collapsing under overuse. The Red Army had men in trenches with no winter coats, no anti-tank shells, and no way to receive them. The order from Moscow was simple. Stabilize your lines, resupply at any cost. But no one explained how. Burkov wasn't an officer. He had no authority. His role was to catalogue rail transfers and keep record of what was destroyed, what was rerouted, and what would never arrive. He had seen every kind of failure. He had walked through burnt-out trucks, traced shell casings along ditches, and counted frozen bodies in the beds of collapsed wagons. He had no solutions. Until the night he remembered the goats. They weren't military. They weren't in the reports. But back in Vyazma, on the edge of the Smolensk rail yards, he used to see them. Shaggy, half-wild mountain goats used by villagers to carry grain or firewood across frozen ground where wheels failed. They moved quietly. They avoided roads. And they never stopped walking, even in whiteout conditions. It was an absurd memory. But in that moment, as a map soaked through with sleet and desperation collapsed in his hands, Burkov had what he later described as the first useful thought I'd had in the entire war. Not goats, but sled runners, the kind used by smugglers before the revolution. Long, low-slung runners, guided not by reins, but by a push-pull relay using ropes and weight balancing. No engine, no wheels, no fuel. Just geometry and snow. He tore a page from the map and started sketching. The concept was idiotic by military standards. Lightweight cargo sleds that avoided roads entirely, pulled manually or guided downhill by slope and balance, using nothing but rope, cloth, and old oil drums as the frame. They could run through forest trails, across frozen riverbeds, even between shelled-out ruins. Most importantly, they wouldn't show up on Luftwaffe aerial surveillance. No heat signature, no wheel tracks, no visibility from the air. The very ridiculousness of it made it possible. That same night, he found 2 broken vehicle sledges behind an abandoned command post. He stripped the runners. He cut planks from a collapsed barrack. He shaped a cargo cradle using wire and melted snow as his hammer press. By morning, he had a prototype. It was barely a meter wide, 2 meters long, weighed under 35 kilograms empty, and could carry 120 kilograms of supplies across snow-packed terrain. He tested it himself. Loaded with canned meat, rifle cartridges, and dressings, he pulled it alone through 3 kilometers of forest between Klin and a front-line unit cut off by shell fire. It arrived. The men didn't ask questions. They just ate. He went back. 2 days later, he returned with 2 more. He recruited 2 other logistics privates, an ex-farmer and a cobbler's apprentice, and built 6 sleds. Each was tuned slightly differently depending on what they carried. One was designed with a weighted drag for explosive shells. Another was shallow and lined with straw for morphine ampules. A third had a leather tarp sewn over it to hide the glint of canned rations from enemy spotters. None had names. They weren't equipment. They were improvisations. By mid-December, Burkhoff's trail method, as it was unofficially called, had delivered over 800 kilograms of supplies to the Klin defensive lines. No losses. Not a single sled was destroyed. But the real shift happened when someone noticed. A lieutenant from Army staff, tasked with investigating why a cut-off rifle company was somehow still holding their line after 3 weeks without reported resupply, traced the logs back to Burkhoff's team. The lieutenant expected black market dealing or ration theft. Instead, he found a man in a ragged tunic boiling rope ends in melted snow to make them more pliable. The lieutenant called it madness. Burkhoff said, "No one sees what isn't on the road." The report, filed under non-standard operations, rear supply methodology, made it to Army Group HQ. They didn't respond. But the sleds kept moving. By late January 1942, as temperatures dropped to 36 degrees and the Luftwaffe intensified its strikes, the traditional truck convoys lost over 60% of their payloads between Mozhaisk and Klin. Meanwhile, Burkhoff's team had completed 94 micro-convoys, 6 sleds at a time in staggered forest paths, with a loss rate of 0. They operated at night. No lanterns, no whistles, just pre-plotted routes memorized by heart. They avoided main roads entirely, using creek beds, fire breaks, even frozen irrigation ditches. They became invisible. They became legend. Infantry started calling them 10 Postavok, the supply shadows. For Burkhoff, it was never strategy. It was necessity. He adjusted sled balance by feel. He mapped trails by instinct. He taught his volunteers how to listen to the snow, how to move silently, how to use tree lines as visual anchors when moonlight failed. He didn't write any of it down, but it worked. The turning point came in February 1942. An entire divisional convoy was ambushed outside Zavidovo. 20 trucks, 17 destroyed, hundreds of tons of supplies lost. The next day, Burkhoff's team delivered 12 sleds worth of bandages, bread and ammunition to the survivors. 12 sleds, 8 men, 1 night. That delivery saved 120 lives. That night, for the first time, a general shook his hand. But even then, the method was never formalized. Why? Because it wasn't doctrine. It was ridiculous. It relied on things the army didn't record: sled balance, snow condition, moonlight, endurance. It required men who could walk silently in -40 temperatures for 12 hours, pulling a cargo sled behind them like a shadow. It couldn't be scaled, but it didn't need to be. By spring, when the Germans retreated from the Klin sector, records showed that Burkhoff's unit had delivered over 17 metric tons of frontline supplies via sled, with a loss rate under 10% and a confirmed convoy survival improvement of 90% in high-risk zones. His methods spread, not officially, but laterally. Other units copied them. One even strapped sleds behind feral dogs trained to follow specific human scents through snow. Burkhoff never asked for credit. When the front moved west, he stayed behind, not because he was ordered to, but because the sleds didn't work on thawed ground. He went back to Vyazma, never promoted, never decorated. But his record showed one line that no one could explain. Responsible for lowest recorded convoy attrition rate in sector history under conditions of total exposure. He died in 1971. His final belongings included a pocket compass, 3 worn rope loops, and a hand-drawn map of a snow trail annotated in pencil. If trees move, you've gone too far. By the end of 1942, rumors of Burkhoff's method had begun to circulate well beyond his original sector. Supply officers from other divisions in the Western and Kalinin fronts quietly sent runners to interview survivors from the Klin trail teams. But there was no manual, no protocol. What they found instead were half-broken sleds stored behind field kitchens, patched together with scraps of radio cable, fence wire, and salvaged metal from destroyed vehicles. In the official logistics reports, they were listed simply as non-mechanized alternate transport. Unofficially, they were called ghost trains. Their strength wasn't just in being unseen, it was that they didn't require anything the army couldn't spare. No gasoline, no replacement parts, no roads. In a war where machinery was eaten by mud, ice, and Luftwaffe fire, this was more than innovation. It was defiance, but not everyone approved. In January 1943, during the build-up to Operation Mars, a regional logistics inspector named Yegor Denisov visited the 41st Army rear area to inspect supply methods. Upon seeing the sled operation in progress, he filed a formal reprimand against the local staff commander, writing, "Current transport protocol being carried out by means of animal-like hauling by human operators, unregulated, inefficient. Optics of this method are unfit for representation of Red Army strength." The commander's response was equally terse. "These optics feed men and deliver bullets. Yours get them killed." The reprimand was buried. The method continued. Meanwhile, Burkov, now informally overseeing multiple sled-based microroutes in the Rzhev sector, began refining the process even further. He introduced rotating trail captains to avoid burnout. He implemented hand signals for night movement, borrowed from old railway semaphore patterns. He stitched cloth harnesses with multiple adjustment points so that smaller men could pull the same sled as larger ones without overbalancing. He even experimented with the weight of silence. One night, he stopped a sled after hearing the faint crack of a tree limb under strain. The sky was too quiet. The snow had hardened. He paused, adjusted the front drag rope by 2 fingers' length, and 30 seconds later, a German mortar round slammed into the place he would have been. They kept moving. He never spoke of intuition, never used the word luck. He believed only in timing and terrain. Every trail was pre-walked, every clearing memorized, every alternate route considered. He drilled his men to recognize what he called dead trails, paths that look passable but kill speed, expose silhouette, or contain crusted snow that sounds different underfoot. He marked routes with knots in tree bark. 3 knots, safe. 2, observation risk. 1, do not proceed. It was fieldcraft born of desperation, refined into an art. In March 1943, the first official internal report acknowledged the method's impact. Non-standard sled convoys operating in rear sectors demonstrate 85–95% delivery success in zones where standard motor convoys suffer 60% attrition due to aerial observation and poor road conditions. Recommend investigation into limited-scale replication where feasible. Nothing came of it. Bureaucracy could not absorb what it did not design. But field commanders began issuing unofficial orders. Supply via Burkov method if motor convoy deemed too exposed. The man himself never learned this. He remained in the shadows, polishing runner blades with sand, boiling flaxseed for harness lubrication, drawing routes by candlelight on scraps of old weather maps. He wore no insignia. He held no rank beyond corporal. But among the infantrymen who opened crates of rifle cartridges and dry bread inside frozen trenches, his name meant something very different than rank. They began to write it in chalk on the sleds. Burkov projot. Burkov will get through. In summer 1943, as the ground thawed and mechanized units surged forward during the Kursk offensive, the sleds were retired, but not forgotten. A company commander in the 29th Guards Rifle Division ordered the runners to be kept in storage, stating, "When the real war returns, the winter war, we'll need them again." He was right. In November 1943, during the operations near Nevel and Velikie Luki, when rain turned the ground to impassable muck and night temperatures fell below -30, Burkov, now reassigned to the 3rd Shock Army, built a new fleet of 16 sleds from materials salvaged from collapsed barns. They operated for 5 weeks, delivered 4.5 metric tons of ammunition, clothing and food, lost 1 sled. That one was hit by a mine. 2 men were killed. The rest insisted on finishing the run. When they returned, Burkov added a new knot code to his marking system, 4 knots mined trail. He carved it into the bark with a bayonet. The method evolved with the war. In 1944, during operations in Belarus, he adapted the sleds to be collapsible, so they could be hidden and reassembled in forest clearings. He introduced waterproof liners sewn from parachute silk, recovered from a crashed Soviet pilot who never made it out of his harness. He was never promoted. He didn't want to be. The moment he received an invitation for officer training, he turned it down. Wrote on the form, "I am of most use on the trail." No one questioned it again. By the winter of 1944, the trail method had ceased to be a curiosity. It had become a contingency. In areas too remote for mechanized columns, too exposed for aerial drop, or too degraded for rail, it was Burkov's pattern that re-emerged. No longer just in the forests of the western USSR, but in the marshes of Belarus, the frozen causeways of East Prussia, and the shadowed forests of Lithuania, where artillery shattered trees like glass and convoys disappeared in minutes. He never used the same route twice. He never left two trails in the same direction. He trained his teams to walk backwards over their own tracks in retreat, dragging pine branches to erase paths. He insisted they speak only in signals once the sleds were loaded. He made them rehearse their breathing rhythm in snow to reduce clouding in moonlight. In one report, a battalion officer described observing one of Burkov's teams from a hillside at dusk. 6 sleds emerged from the tree line with no sound. They moved in staggered formation like geese on water. There was no pause, no command. They disappeared into the next grove like vapor. It took me 30 minutes to find their trail again. That officer later incorporated the method for night evacuations of wounded infantry, using the same sled principles for medical extraction. No one asked Burkov's permission. He wouldn't have expected it. Because he never believed the method was his. He believed it belonged to the war, to the need, and to the men who walked when there were no more trucks, no more tracks, and no more time to wait. In February 1945, as Soviet forces closed around Königsberg and the air filled with ash and wind, Burkov oversaw what would be his final sled operation. Temperatures had dropped again. The terrain was nightmarish, half-frozen bogs, exposed stretches of cracked ice, and roads mined so thoroughly that the engineers simply marked them as lost. The 89th Rifle Division had advanced too quickly, cutting off their own supply. They were out of bread, low on water. Ammunition rations had dropped to 9 rounds per man. The nearest depot was over 20 kilometers back through impassable woods. Burkov loaded 20 sleds. He divided them into pairs, each team assigned to alternate entry points across a marshland, marked by frost and camouflage netting. The crossing would take 11 hours, each direction. He only had 20 volunteers. He didn't ask anyone twice. They carried salt pork, dry rye, water flasks, bandages, 30 caliber rounds, flare cartridges, and letters. Always the letters. They left at dusk. They returned 2 nights later. 18 sleds made it back. 2 men did not. But the front line held. The trail crews were written up for exemplary fulfillment of delivery under hostile terrain and extreme environmental duress. Burkov refused to be photographed. He said, "We are not deliverers, we are continuity." Those were the last words anyone recorded from him. After the fall of Berlin, Burkov was discharged. He boarded a train from Königsberg back toward Vyazma with a duffel bag, a pair of cracked boots, and a single rolled canvas containing fragments of his last sled harness. No one met him at the station. No one remembered his rank. He took a job as a municipal snowplow technician. Quiet, reliable, unimportant. In 1948, a Soviet logistics officer visiting Vyazma for winter transit planning recognized him by accident. When he asked if he was the Burkov, the man looked away and said, "Only when the snow falls." He died in 1966. No family, no gravestone. Only a municipal note. Retired maintenance worker, unknown military history. But in 1973, during a military training exercise in Karelia, a young lieutenant asked an old colonel why, in a certain kind of snowfall, they still taught silent sled movement. The colonel, who had once stood in a trench near Rzhev in a winter long ago, replied, "Because there was once a man who proved that quiet and cold could carry more than steel and gasoline. And because sometimes what saves an army is not a new engine or a better shelter, but a stupid idea done 1,000 times without being seen." The lieutenant didn't understand, but he memorized the drill. In 1985, a cracked photograph surfaced in a rural war museum outside Vyazma. It showed a man in a ragged uniform, holding a sled harness over his shoulder. The caption, misfiled, read, "Unknown Partisan, 1943. A visitor, an old man with missing fingers, stopped in front of it, stared for several minutes and whispered only 2 words. He walked, then turned and left. Because in war, the loudest victories are rarely the most important. Sometimes, it's the quietest path, carved through snow by hands that never asked permission, that keeps an entire army alive. And sometimes, the man who saves the most lives is the one who walks furthest behind, leaving no mark except what others choose to follow. The sleds never truly disappeared. They simply became invisible again. After the war, as Soviet logistics doctrine transitioned fully to motorization and heavy infrastructure, the memory of silent delivery faded beneath the roar of engines and steel. But in remote garrisons across the Urals and Siberian frontiers, junior officers still spoke in hushed tones about a ghost method, a pattern of supply older than fuel, deeper than roads, remembered only when everything else failed. In 1952, during a severe winter supply disruption at a remote Arctic base near Tixi, a young logistics sergeant named Anatoly Voronov reopened a condemned storage barn looking for spare insulation. Inside, under a tarp made brittle by frost, he found 2 sled runners, a stack of rotting hemp harnesses and a paper diagram rolled into a sealed glass jar. It was labeled in pencil, Reserve Trail Configuration, Neville Sector, Winter 1944. Voronov didn't understand what he was looking at, but the lines were clean, the measurements precise. The notation referenced trees and distance, not roads or towns. When the convoy trucks failed to arrive and radio communication dropped for 40 hours, Voronov lashed together a crude cargo sled from the parts he found and pulled 2 kilometers through drifted snow to a relay station with emergency rations. He never learned who designed the original sled. He never heard the name Burkov. But when he was later asked why he risked freezing to death on foot, he simply replied, because the road was gone, but the line was still open. In the 1960s, during a closed-door meeting of military historians at the Frunze Military Academy, a colonel presented a paper titled Unregulated Innovations in Rear Area Warfare, 1941-45. Most of it was procedural, field kitchens, bandage sterilization, improvised oil heaters, but one section drew unexpected attention. It was titled Human Sled Delivery Technique, Klin Reserve Neville Sectors. The colonel cited numbers, delivery tonnage, survival rates, logistics coverage zones. He cited names, none. The footnote simply read, Method originator unrecorded. System proved highly effective but not scalable. Not adopted for formal deployment. Possible application in non-conventional terrain operations. One general laughed. Another murmured, ridiculous. But a third, a thin man with frostbitten ears and a face marked by wind scars, said nothing. He had once stood in a frozen tree line outside Velikiye Luki and watched 6 men glide past like ghosts, dragging crates of ammunition that no one else could deliver. He didn't laugh. There was never a medal, no doctrine, no field manual. The Ministry of Defense never codified the sled method, but it passed, as all real things do in war, through memory. And in 1990, as the Soviet Union began to dissolve, and old veterans were finally allowed to speak freely of their war without filtering it through parades or slogans, a journalist named Arseny Kaledin collected oral histories from logistics battalions along the former German front lines. He interviewed drivers, quartermasters, signalers, fuel specialists. Among them, an 83-year-old man in a rural village outside Vyazma who claimed to have once carried an army on his back through snow. Kaledin didn't understand, until the old man, stooped and half-blind, pointed to the woods behind his house and said, If you walk the trail to the riverbank, you will find a pine tree with 4 deep knots in the bark. That was the mined trail. We marked it after the boys were lost. Kaledin walked the trail the next morning. He found the tree. The knots were still there, not weathered, not healed, still sharp, still angry, still warning. Back in Moscow, Kaledin filed the story. It was never published. Too strange, too unconfirmed, too quiet. But in the archives, it remained, a record of a system that never asked for attention, but never failed its task. In 2010, a graduate student researching non-standard Soviet logistical adaptations during WTO2 submitted a thesis titled Invisible Lines, The Legacy of Burkov's Trail. Her advisor challenged the premise. There were no official sources, no named patents, no diagrams approved by the General Staff. She replied by presenting 37 independent field reports from 1941 to 1945 that referenced non-motor sled delivery, invisible convoys, or quiet resupply, all matching the same radius of operation and identical delivery rates. When asked why this had never been standardized, she answered, "Because it wasn't built to be seen, it was built to arrive." Some say history remembers what is glorious, others say it remembers what is useful, but rarely does it remember what is merely essential, what keeps boots dry, what brings bullets at dusk, what leaves no tracks, except on the souls of those who survive because someone, somewhere, walked through ice and silence with a rope over their shoulder and no name in their pocket. There is no statue of Vladislav Burkov in Vyazma. No street bears his name. In the official records of the Great Patriotic War, his file is 5 pages long, 3 of which refer to equipment intake reports and personnel rotations. The word sled does not appear, nor does innovation, nor does salvation. But in a rusted box inside a forgotten regional archive, mislabeled as agricultural requisition documents, there is a letter. It was never mailed. It is dated March 5, 1945. The handwriting is uneven, stiff with cold. It is addressed to a woman named Elena, though no surname is given. The ink reads, "I do not think the war ends when they say it does. I think the war ends when the last man stops walking, when the last route closes, when no one else is carrying warmth across frozen ground. I am not important. I have seen men do more with less. But I know this. When all the machines froze and the officers shouted and the maps turned red, it was still possible to walk. And I did. Not because I was brave, but because I could still feel the rope in my hand." It is unsigned. A clerk's note added later. Unknown author. Possibly logistics personnel. No one followed up. No one cared. But someone somewhere kept that page from the burn pile. And that too is a form of recognition. In 2020, during renovations of a Soviet-era maintenance depot in Smolensk Oblast, construction workers unearthed a collapsed cellar beneath what was once a wartime barracks kitchen. Inside, stacked against one wall, were 4 narrow sled runners, warped with age, and a sealed wooden crate containing rope harnesses, frozen stiff. A mold-eaten clipboard rested atop them. The first page was unreadable. The second read, "Route 7A through Pines. Watch for third bend. Frost hole on left. Silent crossing only. Do not follow if ice sings." No one knew what that meant, but one historian present on the site, a military researcher specializing in low-profile rear operations, took a photo and muttered, "He marked it for the next one, even if the next one never came." The sleds were preserved. They now sit in the basement of a university archive behind climate glass. There is no public label, just a hand-scrawled tag. Field delivery apparatus, unrecorded pattern. Sometimes the systems that change wars don't arrive with fanfare. They come instead with cracked boots, hoarfrost in the beard, and fingers bleeding from frozen cloth. They move in silence. They leave behind no tire marks, no glowing reports, no chest full of ribbons. They only leave memories, half-formed, half-believed, carried by those who survived because a man they never met dragged half a crate of rifle cartridges through 20 kilometers of unlit snow at night without expecting to be thanked. Not everything worth remembering stands in a square or gets etched in granite. Some things are buried in the tree line, marked by 4 notches in bark, and remembered only by those who had nothing left, except a trail that held, a weight that moved, and the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness, someone still walked. Because supply was not a doctrine, it was a promise, and Burkov kept it.